Hello, welcome to the Kyperian Commentary Podcast. This is episode 131. I'm here with Joffrey Swait, who you may have heard of before or may not have. He has written a couple of books of poetry. He lives in Moscow, Idaho. Joffrey, maybe you could tell us a little about other things you do. I'll let him introduce himself in a minute. The reason I'm having him on was because I was trying to look at things that Kyperian Commentary had published in the past to see if we could get some of our older Kyperian authors up here. And I saw that Joffrey and Yuri Brito had published books 10 years ago, probably, about Christians and pipe smoking. So I thought I would have Joffrey on here to talk to me about pipes, to talk to me about poetry, and whatever else takes our fancy. So welcome to the show, Joffrey.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here with you. Yeah, I'm a teacher. I have a ministry to Brazil. That's my connection with Yuri. We're both Brazilian through my church, Christ Church here in Moscow, Idaho. And yeah, I fancy myself a bit of a poet. I used to have, I have much less now, but I used to have some renown on the internet, and it was because of pipe smoking. Back in the day, if you Googled how to smoke a pipe, I was the number one response. I believe I'm down to page 7 or 8 at this point, but there were glory days when it came to being an authority on pipe smoking.
On pipe smoking, yes. Well, maybe I can get you to tell me how to smoke a pipe. I know how to smoke a pipe, but maybe for our viewers that don't and want to get into the
Yeah.
habit, we could talk about that. So pipe smoking, a lot of guys in our circles, they like a cigar. They like to sit around with big cigars. What makes pipe smoking different? Why did you get into pipe smoking?
Well, I mean, I suppose the aesthetics of pipe smoking were always more appealing to me than cigar smoking in an unexamined kind of way. I actually took up smoking a pipe the first time I lived here in Moscow. So I attended New St. Andrews College for a year. I was older, already married. We had our first kid out here in Moscow before we moved back down south. And during that time, some of us pretentious young humanities students picked up cheap pipes and drugstore tobacco to kind of try to be a little bit more like Lewis and Tolkien. And over that time, studying with the masters of pipe smoking and just formulating my own aesthetic, I developed more concrete thoughts about why I prefer pipe smoking to cigar smoking. But initially, it was just that, hey, we're in an academic setting. We all like, we all like poetry and language and staying up until 3 in the morning studying. So let's smoke bad tobacco and bad pipes. And what
Bad
is this
tobacco with bad
this
pipes.
tongue bite thing you speak of?
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I actually have a video which I will say. So I'm Joffrey the Giant on YouTube, and there's a video on the topic in which I compare cigars and pipes to a certain approach to sex. So I'm going to say that if you search for it, you should do so at your own on your own cognizance, so I think there's a lot of fun to be had with that. It's a ridiculous video because it's a ridiculous defense. Cigars are delicious, pipes are delicious, but I like being able to hold the pipe as an object itself, an object of beauty, an object of art. I like the varieties of tobacco that are available, but I particularly like how the process, and we can unpack this at your discretion, but
Right.
how the process of pipe smoking itself actually has a different effect. So the rituals of pipe smoking are other than the rituals of cigar smoking, and they take you to a different place.
Right. Well, with a cigar, you clip it, you light it, you smoke it. I haven't seen a lot of variation. Maybe the
Right.
type of maybe you've got a punch cutter for your cigar instead of a guillotine cutter. That's
Right.
really the
And
extent.
you can pick your different sizes.
Right.
Some will smoke slower or faster, and then individuals, of course, will smoke slower and faster. But yeah, that's the cigar. I think you approach it as a unique experience,
Mhm.
where of course there's a lot of uniqueness with pipe smoking as well. But there's sort of a bit more of the repetition of the liturgy of it, and it slows you down. Like pipes are very business-like. Pipes are a bow tie, where cigars are like a regular tie. And so It's a bit more involved. You have to learn a little more to be able to do it well, and for it to look normal on you. Uh, but but then there is it's just a different experience, and one that I think is a bit more meditative, where smoking a cigar is a bit more of a punchier experience. I think when you're hanging out with your friends smoking cigars, then yeah, it's going to get manly, of course, but the rhetoric is going to be a little more uh, maybe pugilistic. Where with pipe smoking, it's more congenial. It's more about conviviality. I think pipes are a little more ironic, I guess I might say.
Right. And when you're smoking a pipe, you're partly thinking about your pipe too as you smoke
Yes,
it. You know, you have to keep it going. You don't really have to keep a cigar going. There's no you can lay it down for 10 minutes, pick it up, take a puff, and it's still there.
still there. Yeah, and
Pipe,
yeah, cigars.
there's a
Sorry,
certain pacing to it that you have to, you pace yourself, otherwise you're going to find yourself relighting a lot.
and it's a great mercy of the Lord's that you can actually relight a pipe with no harm to the experience. Right?
Hmm.
Cigars they do stay lit for a long time. If you let them go out though, it's actually considered really uncouth to do it, and it tastes gross. That's why. It's the roots of it just being a thing one doesn't do. Relight a cigar, and
Right.
a lot of new pipe smokers come to it. They feel bad that they're having to relight. Basically, you can't talk for any amount of time and go back to the pipe without relighting. So it depends on what you're valuing at the moment. If you want to have conversation, you need to expect to relight. There's a saying about how one of the virtues of the pipe is that it shuts the mouth of the fool. Because if you want to keep it lit, you can't talk. But if you do want to talk, you want to prioritize that, you should, and then just go back to relighting it without feeling bad about it at all. Now there is an art to as you manage the tamp and you
Right.
manage the bowl, and you can keep it lit, more easily for longer periods of time, and that's something you can improve. But no one should ever feel bad about relighting a pipe.
Right. So I feel like I was going to light my pipe, but since you're talking about cheap pipes, I feel like I need to grab a different one because this is my cheap pipe, which I smoke
Oh,
because I can do it hands free and I can actually
yes.
like mow the grass and have a pipe and have that sort of 1950s dad look going on.
Yep. Yeah, that's
Uh,
pretty great.
and it
Yeah.
and it keeps the
Sorry.
gnats away if you smoke a pipe while you mow. So there you go.
I mean, I think you could even, make an argument that the pipe potentially, like if we were a smoking culture, cigarettes are vicious things. But if we were a smoking culture, I used to see pipe smokers all the time when I lived in Carolina, like
Hmm.
just regular old dudes in their pickup trucks smoking a pipe. They're still kind of alive down there. A pipe is both the highest and the lowest, and the cigar lives in the middle.
Mm,
We have you have your corn cob, right? Or your little beater pipe. You go mow the lawn,
right.
you work in the cornfields, and you have your little corn cob. Fantastic. And then you also have your highfalutin pipes with your highfalutin cigars, and you can look professorial if you want to, but it kind of just has that range. And the hands-free aspect is really pretty great.
Right.
A cigar is a little harder to manage that way. So certainly for working, like you can actually work with a pipe in your mouth, which is awesome.
Yeah. Um, I started smoking after I was married. Before that, I'd tried cigars. So I think that might be a natural progression, like you're talking about.
Yeah.
You want to look professorial. You become a teacher. The building that we used to meet in as a church, there was a college that met there, and there was a guy there. One of the teachers would walk around with a pipe all the time. But I remember my uncle when I was a kid. I grew up in Virginia, which is
Mhm.
close to Carolina, and I think this area has a lot more of that culture where you'll see my uncle would just walk around with a pipe. And
Yep.
sometimes it was lit and sometimes it wasn't.
Right.
His pipe was sort of just a fixture. It was part of him all the
Amazing.
time. So you write poetry too.
Mhm.
I've just read the book of poetry you wrote that Canon published that I really enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you.
And I might ask you a little bit more about that too, but tell me, how do pipes and poetry go together? Because I picture a poetry writer smoking a pipe. I
Mhm.
picture a cigar writer or a cigar smoker uh, writing Hemingway style prose.
Yes. Yeah, I get the same image. Yeah. And I'm sure people give examples galore that would break our little image there. But yeah, I think that's right. And well, one of the main reasons I write poetry is actually to organize myself, and to bring to conclusion the things that have been bouncing around in my mind. So I keep a journal. I call it a journal. Just say I keep a notebook on me at all times, just to jot down random phrases or whatever. Maybe I'm listening to a sermon, or I've watched a show, or had a conversation and I want to get some things down. And I don't journal, and I also usually don't sit down to write a poem. I'm just always jotting things down. And as the stuff is ruminating up there, you know, it needs to come to a point, so I can move on. And so that's the main reason I write poetry, I would say. Also, the love of language, which would, something I, enjoy talking about. You can kind of probably see some language books and all that around. But because the pipe is meditative, like it really is, like once you get into pipe smoking, you see how it slows you down to its own heart rate.
Mm,
Like pipe smoking has a slower rate than at least my life runs normally, right? So I move faster than a pipe. So when I am hanging out with a pipe, it slows me down, and that makes it easier for me to write. It's been documented that nicotine is a sort of a focuser.
hmm
A lot of writers of old endorsed the use of tobacco for that. So I'm sure that plays a role as well. But what I notice is that the fact that the act of smoking a pipe slows me down.
Right. So who are some of your favorite poets that you like to read?
Yeah. So my favorite poet, I would say, is Gerard Manley Hopkins,
Mm,
18th century Jesuit who was kind of unknown, published very few things in his life, but he had been friends with Robert Bridges, who became a poet laureate of Britain later after Hopkins' death. He actually published. So Hopkins wrote in the 1880s, thereabouts. He was published in 1918, and his poetry actually affected a generation or two of poets after him, which I think
right.
is fascinating. But he writes in a very English, Anglo-Saxon kind of way. It's very rhythm driven, very alliterative. And I love that about English. I love that it combines the Anglo-Saxon with the Latin so nicely. So I like Hopkins for that reason. I like T.S. Eliot.
Mm.
I like Milton. I love George Herbert. John Donne is a favorite as well. And kind of sneakily, C.S. Lewis is a favorite poet of mine. I don't actually love his.
Interesting.
There are two collections that Hooper put together. There's like an epic poems collection, which doesn't really charm me. But then there's just poems by C.S. Lewis. And I would recommend that collection to anybody.
I
He's
need to
really
check that out.
approachable. Yeah. Oh, and Billy Collins. Speaking of approachable, I love Billy Collins, who was about 20 years ago as poet laureate. Has a very approachable voice. Snobs don't like him.
I was actually going to ask you about that because I saw a little bit of the Billy Collins influence there,
Huh.
um, in your poetry. You know, the reason I know about poetry is because of my wife. She picked me up as a theology student in college who read nothing but theology books, and she
Ooh,
introduced me to Chesterton and George MacDonald, and I
yeah.
read Narnia for the first time in my 20s. I didn't have that as a kid. So,
Yeah.
I was a late comer to a lot of that.
Well,
But
poetry
yeah.
is not the only approach to broadening, just your love of word and the word,
Mhm.
of course. But I do think it is sort of an apex towards which a lot of that builds. It's such condensed and expressive language.
Right.
Just kind of talking about how you discovered poetry. I've always been of the mind that so many theology students are so narrow for so long. And I often, in talking to seminarians, wish they had taken a history class that wasn't church history.
Right.
You know? It's just like it's just I think pastors should have some breadth, and no one can ever be you know the Renaissance man, right? But pastors should strive to understand their people, and you can take that up by learning how to make a table if you're not really a carpenter, Or if you are a carpenter turned a pastor, learning to appreciate some poetry or,
Right.
reading some ancient romance. And I think that is only going to make you a better pastor. You don't have to read all the theology books.
Right. It's like Chesterton said, if a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing badly.
Yes,
You
I
do
love
it
that.
because it's worth doing, not because you're good at it.
Right.
Which is true of so many things. Just on the topic, I see a lot of that in Moscow, and I think the CREC in general has an
Yes.
ethos about it that says, "Let's roll up our sleeves and do stuff."
Right.
Well, wait a minute, you're not professional educators. You can't start a college. Well, we just did.
Right.
You don't know how publishing works. Well, we just started a publishing house, so there it is.
And
And
it's
just
funny.
doing
Sorry.
things, right?
Right. Right. Precisely. And it's funny how much of the criticism that comes to the CREC's way um, has to do with they put exactly that in a negative light, right? Like
Yeah.
they're not really theological, or the theology is sort of a side thing, and they just go and do things. And I was even reading an article recently where it's like, just don't fall for all that stuff. Don't put the theology to the side. Their theology is not, but you'll get distracted by the fact that they're doing so many awesome things.
Right.
What are you do? What are you doing here?
Yeah. Experts are supposed to do that. Didn't you know? You're
Yeah.
not certified
Yeah, exactly right.
and stuff. Yes. So uh, I noticed also, let me try to tie these two threads together here because I've got your book here on my phone. Uh oh, where did I put it? There it is. Um yes. So even as I was reading your book, pipes find their way into poetry with you several
Yep.
times. One poem in particular, I'm not going to read your poem to you because I know probably as a poet, hearing someone else read your own poem out loud is probably not something you enjoy a lot. I wouldn't think hearing
It would
hearing
be
someone
absolutely
else write
fine,
your
but I'd also be pleased to read it for
yeah.
for you and your audience.
Yeah, the ending of the poem, it's talking about in older days when people said yes sir and yes ma'am, when men wore
Yes.
coats and hats. The last stanza says, "In those days of always deference, when life was shorter and tighter, in those days a man could light his pipe or not, as he wished." I like that line. In those days, a man could light his pipe or not, as he wished. Um, why don't we see as much pipe smoking today in a time when life isn't shorter and tighter? Life is broader and looser, and it seems like you should have more time for that sort of thing.
Yeah.
What
Well, I think
happened to
that's
pipe
precisely
smoking?
why we don't value our time as much, because we have so much of it. But we're also simultaneously more frightened of death. When
Mm,
life was shorter, the idea that tobacco might not be good for you, which even that, by the way, is up for debate. What's definitely
right.
not good for you is the chemicals in cigarettes. Um, but that idea wasn't as frightening, right?
Right.
Some wrinkled old man is just going to tell you you got to go somehow, right? And so that fear of death, and that so long life is actually warping us, and we appreciate our time less. We are bored and boring more, and we don't try to take advantage of our time.
Right.
So I think when you're actually even the search for pleasure, like seeking pleasure,
Mm,
I mean, to seek pleasure is a good thing, and to seek the happiness above that, and ultimately to seek joy with God, those are all good things. And we seek gratification
mm,
instead of real pleasure.
right.
We have absolutely no appreciation for small pleasures, and pipe smoking is a small pleasure.
Right. And it's also I heard someone say this one time, and I really wish that I could remember the source. But they were talking about Lewis and Tolkien and about how when Lewis would write about heaven, it was always transcendental. Reading Lewis describe heaven, it's like Dante. It's always this very symbolic, transcendental description. And with Tolkien, when he wrote about heaven, it was always a bunch of men sitting around a fire smoking pipes. Is the small pleasures in life, which kind of fit with his ethos of the hobbits, small things,
Yes.
small pleasures.
But
But yeah, go
we
ahead. Sorry.
I've been talking to my students as we go through humanities classes about, well, you can imagine I'm teaching 4 different levels of humanities. You can imagine we talk about everything, but one of the themes that's been coming up repeatedly is the importance of the incarnation and the resurrection. And I have students from a lot of different Christian backgrounds in my classes, and so just talking about, well, what is our eternal life, not only like now, but what is it going to be like? And what is it going to be like in the new heavens and the earth and the resurrection? And when you're reading Plato and Aristotle and everything's becoming kind of disembodied.
Right.
So I just asking the question of the students, because I know I had this thought, and there are always people who fess up to it as well. Just the idea that heaven's going to be boring,
Hmm.
right? Like
Right.
I understand. Okay, there's going to be some sort of bliss thing, but like, can I really do this forever? Right.
Right.
And I think there are lots of things that we can bring to bear to that are important, and will no, God really has a great calling for us, and it's not going to be some sort of nirvana thing. So we can talk about the new heavens and the new earth and the importance of the bodily resurrection. But I also think having a very, like, just a strong idea of the small pleasures and of just constantly living life, not only upheld by God, but doing things for God. I think it's actually easier to imagine that eternity in small things. We know no details,
Right.
right? But I love the idea that Tolkien would have been thinking of it that way, because that really is where contentment and happiness is to be found for us, I think, in the little things we do every day.
Yeah, and especially here in our creaturely life on Earth, in the new Earth, we're going to still be creatures forever, right?
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
I think there's, well, I mean, you can't read Dante and see the beatific vision and not be moved by it. So I
Yes.
think there's
Yes.
definitely that aspect of eternity is important. But you're right, when we focus on that, and then you end up having like the Philadelphia cream cheese commercials where you've got the angels and the harps and they're eating
Yeah.
cream cheese for all eternity on a cloud.
Yeah.
You know,
Exactly. Yeah.
heaven seems boring if that's what you do, but
Right.
good stuff. Mm. So, um, I enjoyed that poem a lot.
Thank
Trying
you.
to see if I had any others that I marked because I have been trying to read more poetry this year. I've been trying to read a book of poetry each month. So I was happy to find yours because that was my poetry for the
Thank you.
month. Um,
And actually, if I can plug, the audiobook is available on Canon Plus,
oh,
and I would be flattered if anyone in your audience chose to listen to it.
right. I will mention, I'm going to link your book in the description, and I'll also mention that it's on Canon Plus. I don't know that I can link that. Did you read it, or did you have someone
Yes,
else read
yeah,
it?
my
Okay.
reading. And actually, I do a lot of the reading on Canon Plus.
Oh, really? I
Yeah.
did not know that. Okay. What are some of the things you've done?
I've done a couple of lighthearted books on literature,
Mm.
Ascent to Love being one of them, speaking of Dante.
Mm.
One of his books on the Lord's Supper, his name is escaping me right now. I'm reading Keith Matheson's Sola Scriptura. I've done a bunch of literature, like worldview guides, just a few Doug Wilson books here and there. I'm their most frequent reader. So any of the new things that come out, you're very likely to hear my voice.
Okay, there you go. I'm going to make a confession. I have Canon Plus, but haven't listened to it a whole lot. So, because a
I'm
lot of
actually
it, I look
not
for
of
it
an
like I've read that
audiobook.
Doug Wilson book. I've read that Doug Wilson book. I've read that
Right.
one.
Yeah, I'm not much of an audiobook listener myself. I'm
Yeah.
becoming slightly more so, but
Right.
um, yeah.
So let's talk about sort of that idea of the little pleasures in life, the little small things, your day-to-day life. Uh, and I'm going to read this entire poem from your book, Friendly Aphorism. It's only one stanza, so it's
Yeah.
short, but it's really apt for our world today. Friends have I by the hundred, friends I fetch by the penny. Friends, where are you? I wondered, for he has none who has many. Um, I have lots and lots of friends on Facebook and on Twitter.
Yes.
Are you saying I don't really have many friends?
I'm suggesting that to you for sure. Yeah,
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
Tell me, just about that idea. Friendship is truncated a lot in our world today, where we're seeking not even deep pleasures, but just seeking distraction, satiation, amusement. Um, how do we get back to true friendships?
I think it's very hard. I mean, even when Aristotle was writing about friendship, he talked about how perfect friendships, true friendships, perfect friendships are rare because of busyness, right? Because life gets in the way. And I think we're even more potentially victim to that. So, I mean, that's been perennially the problem. I do think that part of what I'm addressing, you mentioned Facebook, is that online, like we trick ourselves into thinking we have many friends. It is needful for men to have friends, and I suppose I mean that both mankind, but also it's particularly a problem for males.
Right.
And we can trick ourselves into thinking we have friends because we have company. I'm very
Mm,
comfortable online. I'm always online. I suggested to some students recently who are working on a big project that they just oh, we have some trouble meeting, etc. Well, if you know you're going to be working, just turn your camera on, go to a Zoom room and just start working together. You don't
right.
have to be talking all the time. You can just be like, to me it actually feels like we kind of are in the same place. I'm
Right.
very comfortable online, and the more like that we are, I think the more susceptible we are to deceive ourselves in that way. These are real friends, and at best these are friends of convenience or friends of
Mm,
empathy and sympathy. These aren't true friends. True friends are ones who wish well to one another, right? And if you have two people who wish well to one another in a disinterested way, not looking for what they can get out of each other, that's the friendship that you
right.
want. And I think it's impossible to have more than two or three people like that. They're very rare in your life ever to have two people who actually are truly more concerned for the other. Because it's not like, I think it's very easy for us to then say, well, uh, those are what these other friendships you're describing are false friendships. That's not the
Right.
case.
Mm,
It's it's actually it's good to have friendships where I get something out of this and you get something out of this. That's
yeah.
that's good, and that's very normal. But that blessed perfect friendship,
Right.
it's going to enrich our lives. And I would even say that at a minimum, we need to live in community.
Mm,
Have those friends where, like, maybe I'm in some trouble and you can help me out, or the things that you say enrich my life, so there's some utility and some pleasure in that.
right.
um, but just community ought to lead to love, right? And we're all living toward love, this that ascent that Dante
Right.
uh, talked about. We're all living toward love, so at a minimum in community. But community isn't just being around each other, and
Hmm.
friendship isn't just being around each other. So the poem itself, just a little aphorism, is a call to examine where you are in that. Actually, I was talking about friendship recently in my classes, and it bummed me out that day because I thought, I sort of looked around and asked myself,
Mm.
like, it's the classic thing. I'm a 46-year-old man. Like, I am the age that the sociologists write about, worried that these men are lonely. Like,
Right.
this is that age. And so, but that examination should take you into God's grace and maybe make you go to church more.
Oh, that's a very good point. Yeah. Lewis lays out the differences between different friendships really well in The Four Loves, too, which
Yes.
is a great book, and does a good job of not saying that this is bad, this is good. They're all good, but they're
Right.
different kinds of good. And Jesus had thousands of followers. I'd say 12 companions and three close friends, right? I mean,
Right.
that's even the picture we get.
And among those three close friends was the disciple whom Jesus loved.
Right.
Right. Like, even within that, there was a sort of a hierarchy. And I think the word hierarchy is helpful because we have really pedestrian ideas out there in modern attitudes, like the hierarchy of needs,
Mm,
which, is accurate as far as it goes. And I imagine if there was one to whom, with whom Jesus had a very special relationship, and then these closer friends, and then these 12 that he could rely on. except for the one. You know, I mean that would have been a reflection, certainly, of his own desires,
Hmm.
possibly of his own needs as a man.
It's a good thing to think about. Yeah, and you know, we have that hierarchy, and it's hard to even think about in our egalitarian world, but you know, we like to think we love everybody equally and just the same. Everything's just this one mess. And that does lead to loneliness because then you don't have a real friend, someone who's close. So
Yeah, that's right. And if you say you love everybody equally, which I don't think anyone would actually just say those
Mhm.
words, but we actually think that that's a good towards which we should strive. And
Right.
so what that ends up meaning, though, is that you actually don't love anybody. You just have nice thoughts toward everybody.
Right. Now, I think it's good to even understand that an individual person can't have a ton of really close friends. I think in big ministries, you know, I know our pastor Virgil came from Moscow 20 plus years ago. He came 24 years ago now. He came to Lynchburg, but he was there at Moscow. And he said even then there were a lot of people coming who had read Doug's books or listened to things by him, and they thought, I'm going to go to Moscow and be Doug's best friend.
Right.
You know, there's a sort of a figure who can't give themselves, you can't give yourself to everybody. You've got to
That's
guard
right.
yourself and
I mean,
and it's
I've had
okay.
to
That's
do
fine.
that. Exactly. I've had to do that with my own extremely minor and already past fame. And Yuri Brito, a pastor in the CREC, recently on Twitter, he had a bit of a kerfuffle because one of the ways he guarded himself is to minimize his
Mm,
interaction with anonymous Twitter accounts.
right.
That's not a rule I ever had, but I certainly had other rules. Like if people put comments on my YouTube page that were more than a paragraph, I didn't read them.
Right.
Like it was always people who felt entitled to an essay in response
Mm,
and who actually felt entitled to my time. Like this is the comments section, and here's an essay. An essay is not a comment, right? And that entitlement led me to have to guard myself, right?
right.
But we actually have we kind of reverse that idea of I can be friends with anyone, and you sort of think everyone should be that way. I'm equal. I'm as you put yourself out there. I'm entitled to your time.
Right. Yeah. Well,
We
Joffrey,
all have to
thank
deal
you.
with it. Yeah, yeah. Sorry.
Speaking of entitled to your time, thank you for giving me a half an hour of your time.
Oh,
Um,
it's been a pleasure.
it's ticking away, so I'm gonna have to wrap up, but I've enjoyed getting to talk to you. For you who are listening, get a little more poetry in your life, smoke a pipe, and find some good friends. I think that's our takeaway today on
Fantastic.
the
Thanks
Hyperion
for having me.
Commentary Podcast. And I will put in the description below the video, I'll put a link to Joffrey's book and probably find your video about how to smoke a pipe and link that too.
Fantastic.
Sounds good. Well, thanks for being here.
Cheers.
All right. You have a good one.
Bye bye.